Haere mai, tēnā koutou. Welcome to the Spring Talk series, Psychology Bite-Sized, brought to you by the School of Psychology of Te Herenga Waka, Kura Hinengaro. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you in a second Marc Wilson, Professor Marc Wilson, who you see already on the screen. But I would just like to talk a little bit briefly about the series. So this is going to be a couple of talks talking all around psychology and psychological behavior, like the psychological view on behavior, how humans behave and how we can understand that better. And this is brought to you by people who actually have studied that intensively and who want to share their knowledge with you and give you the opportunity to discuss it also. So we'll have some part of talk at the beginning, and then you can ask questions later on. So feel free to pop in questions throughout into the Q&A box or in the chat, preferably in the Q&A box. And we'll come to that towards the end in our discussion section. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker of the series, Professor Marc Wilson, to you, who's been at Te Herenga Waka for a very, very long time. He's basically inherent, like a basic keystone in the Department of Psychology and also in the university. He has always had apparently a key interest in human behavior, so in the social way that people interact, and also the way that that these interactions impact on the future and on attitudes and anything that has to do with human well-being, youth well-being as well, to why do people eat meat or don't eat meat. Also social dominance. So how is it that groups behave in a certain way? And he is today sharing with us some of his experience and knowledge about conspiracy theories. So I'm very pleased to introduce Marc to you and handing over to Marc to share what he wants to talk about, conspiracy theories.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you so much for that introduction, Hedwig. Whoever that person was, he sounded very interesting. I look forward to meeting him at some point. So hopefully you can see my screen now. I'm going to take the absence of commentary to suggest that you can. So as Hedwig's indicated, I've been at Te Herenga Waka for a long time. I came here as a small child after completing my undergraduate study here at Victoria University, completed a PhD, and then did a bunch of unpleasant jobs that no one else wanted to do until I got a job. And that job was teaching research methods, advanced research methods in 2003. And one of the things I rapidly learned in the process of developing that course was that not everyone studies psychology to learn about research methods. In fact, most people are here because they're interested in psychology, and I'm just going to get rid of the floating meeting controls. And so I had to find a vehicle to teach research methods and statistics. And I learned very early on that there are many things in everyday life that are highly motivating for people to study. Paranormal beliefs, and more recently, conspiracy beliefs. So I used those as a vehicle to teach people how to do psychological research. And along the way, I also conducted a fair amount of research on these topics myself. So I'm going to give you a bit of a wander through those studies that I conducted, as well as linking into international research and some things that some of my colleagues have done. I promise you that I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID, but I'm going to start off by giving you an introduction to conspiracy theories and the psychology of conspiracy theories to start off with. So, a couple of caveats. It is not my intention to make fun of people who believe in conspiracies. There are a number of very good reasons for this that I will get to shortly, one of which is that there is evidence that conspiracy theories have and do happen. Secondly, we live at the moment in a world in which we have a global pandemic. And the big discussion in Aotearoa, New Zealand right now is whether or not to get vaccinated. The majority of New Zealanders have done so already. More than 85% of those eligible have had at least one vaccination. I'm double vaccinated myself. And I had the advantage of working in an institution that has a world-class library and work alongside people who work in vaccine development. As a result, I am fairly convinced that this is the right thing to do and that it's safe. But I understand that people who may not have access in the privileged way that I do to that information may have concerns. So take it from me as an expert, it's a good thing to get done. And if you don't believe me, believe the people around you. When you walk down the street today, statistically, 8 or 9 of the people you walk past will have been vaccinated, and they have been vaccinated entirely safely. So, quick primer on conspiracy theories. If we look through the history of conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory research, psychology has come fairly late to the party. In fact, it wasn't until the mid-1980s with the publication of a book called Changing Conceptions of Conspiracy that psychological researchers became interested in this topic. But it wasn't for another 15 or 20 years until people like myself became interested that we started to see a burgeoning of research on this area. At the same time, there is a long history of conspiracies and conspiracy theorizing that we can draw upon. Let's take as an example the American $1 note minted in 1935. There's lots of things going on in this particular piece of currency. I'm only going to focus on the Great Seal to the left of the note. Specifically, conspiracy theorists have suggested that if you use the all-seeing eye, supposedly representative of an omnipresent, omnipotent, all-seeing God, and we create 2 opposing triangles, we can see the letters spelling out Mason. So the A of Annuit, the S of Oceptus, the N of Novus, the O of Ordo, and the M of Seclorum, spelling out the word Mason. In fact, Novus Ordo Seclorum means New World Order, and this is a term that people who have spent a little bit of time in conspiracy theory circles will be intimately familiar with. Some conspiracy theorists argue the traditional symbol represents that of Freemasonry. If we take the calipers and set square and place them in the way that they're routinely presented, it looks a lot like this 6-pointed circle. This in turn points to a demonic Jewish conspiracy to topple Christianity. In fact, we find the all-seeing eye in a variety of other symbology. For example, the logos of media empires CBS and Time Warner, and even that of MI5. For those of you who don't know, MI5 is that branch of the British Secret Service that's responsible for making sure that people within the United Kingdom are safe. Not at all suspicious. Coming back to currency, if you take an American $10 note minted between 1998 and 2003 and you fold it just so, you end up with an image that looks an awful lot like the Twin Towers after being struck by the 2 planes that were flown into them by terrorists on September 11, 2001. Again, this adds fuel to the idea that the Masons, who based on that $1 note we know already rule the world, are responsible for the events of 9/11. And indeed, of course, this is particularly concerning because this $10 note was minted 3 years before the events of 9/11. At the same time, 9/11 plays an important role in the popularization of both conspiracy theories and the development of research on conspiracy theories themselves. This is a GIF of static images taken from a parking camera outside the Pentagon as the plane unsuccessfully intended to destroy it, crashed into it on 9/11 in 2001. In fact, if you go online, you'll find various examples of this image which have been doctored to suggest that it was in fact a missile. But I show you this because there has been an increase in interest in conspiracy theories since the events of 9/11, and this coincides with the development of the internet. The reality is that up until 9/11, the number of people who were naturally interested in conspiracy theories was sufficiently small that they could walk down the street without meeting anyone who believed the same things as them. The internet has provided a forum in which people who believe in things that may not be mainstream to come together and to talk about the things that they believe. And potentially, depending on your viewpoint, it provides an echo chamber in which people can have their beliefs about things like conspiracies reinforced. But conspiracies have been with us for a long time prior to 9/11. Perhaps one of the oldest that we're aware of, or that gets talked about in the literature, is the idea of blood libel, popularized in the book and movie The Da Vinci Code. Blood libel is the idea that the Jewish people for hundreds of years, if not millennia, have been kidnapping and murdering Gentile people to mix their blood into the bread that they use as part of their Passover celebration. So here on the slide, I have an image of a woodcut which was made in the 1500s. This has been around for an awful long time. And it's easy for us to sit here in our privileged vantage point and think, but who would be silly enough to believe that now? But if we go fast forward to 2002, approximately 20 years ago, this is an example of a scan of a poster which was put up around San Francisco University as part of a global campaign criticizing the actions of the Israeli state in Palestine that draws off this idea of blood libel. Palestinian children meat slaughtered according to Jewish rites under American license. The point that I'm trying to make here is that it's very easy to characterize things like conspiracy theories as a bit of a laugh, but they actually do have implications for our everyday lives. And probably the poster child for the most important example of this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Between 1932 and 1972, African-American men and their families who had been diagnosed with syphilis were invited to get free medical treatment for their condition. They would rock up to these things that look, it looks like a Winnebago, but it's not that far away from something like our vaccination buses that are traveling around the country at the moment to receive their free treatment. They would they would complete a survey talking about their symptoms, and they would walk away with a bottle of pills to help them. Now, the sad tragedy of this was the pills they were given were not in fact an active treatment. They were sugar pills, and the intention of this whole study was not to cure syphilis, but to study how syphilis develops and the consequences of it if left untreated. So part of the tragedy here is that it went on for 40 years. In fact, by the time that a whistleblower drew attention to this atrocity, many of the people who had first designed it had already died, as had many of the participants in the Tuskegee syphilis study. There was a big congressional investigation. There was reparations made. The people who had been affected received the princely sum of $1,000, assuming that they hadn't died. If they themselves had died, it was passed on to their family. But of course, syphilis is an STI. That means that you pass it on to your nearest and dearest, which meant that many of their wives had died. In fact, STIs like syphilis can be transmitted to babies as they're born, so many of their offspring died as well. It is no surprise, therefore, that among African Americans, the uptake and adherence to drugs like HIV/AIDS treatments, for example, are much lower than they are amongst other racial groups, in part because African Americans have been shown to believe, a third of them have been shown to believe that the American government is experimenting upon them, a third are not sure, and a third believe that actually it's completely coincidental. If you believe that the medical authorities who are telling you to take drugs are the same ones who've experimented on you, I don't think it's a surprise that you don't pay attention to what they say. In fact, very recent research in the context of COVID-19 shows that African Americans are amongst the most vaccine hesitant. Approximately a third of African Americans say that they feel very uncomfortable with the idea of taking the vaccine. Close behind them are Republicans at about 29%. I'm going to talk briefly about both of these groups as we move through this presentation. In fact, New Zealand has its own conspiracy magazine, Uncensored, first published in the mid-2000s in a slightly odd collaboration between international conspiracy theorist Jonathan Eisner and one of perhaps New Zealand's most prolific pornographers, Stephen Crow, and in fact continues to this date. I've noted the importance of the internet for the dissemination of conspiracy theories and the opportunity for people who believe in conspiracy theories to come together. Uncensored continues online as well as in print, and it has a significant section devoted to COVID conspiracies. So, for example, Joe Biden ignores DC mask mandate in latest round of COVID hypocrisy, and very recently from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern says that everyday activities won't be available to the unvaccinated. So how common are conspiracy beliefs? It's very easy to characterize these as the preserve of a very small and slightly wacky group of the population. So I'm going to present some data from a study that I conducted a number of years ago now. It involved, I disseminated it through popular media, through the Sunday Star Times newspaper. More than 6,000 New Zealanders completed it. It involved a survey of a whole bunch of different things about New Zealanders' spiritual lives. It asked them about religion, their paranormal beliefs, but it also asked about conspiracies and urban myths. And these are the broad results. There are several take-home messages from this. The first is that depending on what you think of as a conspiracy theory, there is quite a lot of diversity in the extent to which people believe, are uncertain, or don't believe in a particular idea. So, for example, something like 80% of New Zealanders say that the Iraq War was not about oil, was not about democracy, but it was about oil. Something like 60%, so 40% of New Zealanders believe that New Zealand is manipulated by big business. In fact, 35% of New Zealanders argue that the All Blacks were poisoned before the 1995 World Cup to make it easier for the Springboks to win that rugby championship. Those are really reasonably large numbers, but if we move down towards the opposite end, we find that something like 8% of New Zealanders say, in fact, fewer than 8% of New Zealanders say that Elvis faked his own death, that there is a conspiracy against Māori, that Diana was assassinated, rather than dying in a tragic car accident. And something like 20% of New Zealanders argue that say that the NASA moon landings were faked. Importantly, I think it's safe to say that the majority of New Zealanders will believe in at least one conspiracy, but something like 5% or less will believe in enough conspiracy theories to be considered a conspiracy theorist. We're talking about a relatively small group of the population, but many of us believe in at least one thing that might be characterized as a conspiracy theory. So why do people endorse conspiracy theories? Why do people believe these things? Up until the early 2000s, we didn't have very much research upon which to answer these kinds of questions, but there was a reasonable amount of theory. Probably one of the most common theoretical explanations for this is something that has been called the social marginality or deprivation hypothesis. This is the idea that people who occupy marginalized positions in society, low status positions in society, economically disadvantaged positions in society, are more likely to endorse deviant beliefs like paranormal phenomena, religious phenomena, or conspiratorial phenomena, in part because it helps to gain an explanation as to why people sit in the positions that they do in our society. More recently, eminent psychologists like Serge Moscovici and Ari Kraglinski have argued that conspiratorial thinking is the province of the disenfranchised. In part, it serves the function of helping us reconcile our frustrated aspirations. But what does the data say? Here's my first example of research conducted in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Here we have Anna Stoyanov and her PhD supervisor, Jamin Halberstadt, who looks a bit like an otter in this photograph. What Anna did in her PhD was to try and test systematically this idea that lacking control or lacking power was associated with conspiracy beliefs. In one of the studies in her PhD, subsequently published in 2020, she took advantage of a statistical technique called meta-analysis. Now, in many experimental studies, we have relatively few participants. Experiments are hard. They take a lot of work. And as a result, we often don't have very many people that we're able to recruit to participate in them. This creates the problem that sometimes we might find support for our hypothesis, not because that hypothesis is not worth supporting, but perhaps because we didn't have enough people to test it. Meta-analysis is a technique that takes advantage of smushing all of those studies together and taking advantage of their combined statistical power. But as we can see in the circle, the triangle, the square in the circle here, when you take all of these things and smush them together, the relationship between lack of control or having control and conspiracy endorsement is about 0. There is limited evidence based on the international literature to suggest that this is actually a worthwhile hypothesis. But maybe it's not that simple. One of the studies which Stoyanov and Halberstadt looked at in their meta-analysis was conducted by Whitson and Galinsky and published in 2008 in a very eminent publication, Science. Whitson and Galinsky showed their participants a series of what they call snowy pictures. Half of these snowy pictures are just degraded pictures of nothing. So for example, our second panel here. At the same time, some of the pictures are degraded pictures of something real. When I look at this, the second line, the first on the left, for example, I see something that looks to me a little bit like a tent. Not everyone will necessarily see that, and that's what they take advantage of. The participants, before being shown these pictures, are put into one of two conditions. They're asked to either solve mathematical problems that they can solve, they're very simple, or they're given mathematical problems that cannot be solved. This is the low power condition. They argue that perhaps if control is associated with conspiracy theories, then what we should see is that people will see things in pictures when there aren't something, when they are in a position of low control. And in fact, according to Anna Stoyanov and Jamin Halberstadt, this study shows limited evidence for this hypothesis that control or a lack of control leads to conspiracy theorizing. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe some people are more likely to see conspiracies than others. In the 1950s, a term apophenia was coined to describe the idea that sometimes some people make connections between things that other people wouldn't make. They might see things that other people don't see. So for example, we have an ultrasound here that some people might see as an image of Jesus, but not all of us would see that. The idea of apophenia is that some of us are more likely to make these connections than others. And this is an idea that a student of mine and John McDowell at Te Ranga Waka tested a number of years ago. Dashani Kumareshwaran took this basic paradigm, what Whitson and Galinsky did. You give people mathematical problems that they either can or can't solve. You then show them these snowy images, some of which are based on something real and some of them which aren't. And we look to see whether or not people saw things in these images, depending on whether they were in a situation of low or high control. Now, what the statistics here are supposed to show you is that actually, regardless of whether people were given a task they could complete, there was no difference in people's ability to correctly identify that there were or were not meaningful images in those stimuli. But what we also did was to administer a measure that was designed to assess the extent to which people make these connections between things, their tendency to see things that other people might not see. In fact, when a person is given tasks they cannot complete and they score high on this thing called magical thinking, this making of connections between things, they were much more likely to see things in those snowy images where there wasn't anything than see things that weren't present. When people don't feel control and they exhibit this trait of magical thinking, they're more likely to see things when there aren't things there. I think that this makes kind of sense, right? If you're the kind of person who draws these kind of connections, and maybe you have a reason to look for connections to be drawn, you're the sort of person who looks out your window and you see the black van sitting out in the street and you think to yourself, that's interesting. I'm pretty sure I saw that a week ago. Maybe it's someone surveilling the neighborhood. Maybe it's someone who's checking up on me. A second theoretical position on deviant beliefs, including conspiracy theories, is the idea of something called the cognitive correlates or deficits hypothesis. This is perhaps characterized most strongly by Otis and Alcock in 1981. They argue that the reason why people believe weird things is because they're weird. There's something wrong with them, that they are in some way mentally deficient. In fact, there is a fairly widespread stereotype of the conspiracy theorist as someone who wears a tinfoil hat, who believes really, really crazy things that no one would possibly believe, in part because there's something wrong with them. They're psychologically disordered. Surprisingly few people have looked at whether or not this might in fact be the case. So here's an example of one simple study. It involves first-year psychology students, something like 90, well, yeah, it's probably an exaggeration, at least 75% of all published psychology up until the 2000s was based on first-year psychology students. Psychology is in fact the study of psychology students. And in this survey, what I did was to administer a measure of conspiracy belief, but also several measures of paranoia and psychopathology, psychological distress. Paranoia is a really interesting thing to study. People who study paranoia experimentally and in research don't just ask people, are you paranoid? Instead, what they do is they ask people, have you ever had the following belief, that you're being followed? How frequently have you had that? Do you believe that it's the case that you're being followed? And how distressing is it that you believe this? Because it's possible for people to think, yeah, occasionally I think that I'm being followed, but I don't worry about it. I don't have it very often. And actually, to be quite honest, I don't believe that it's true. You're paranoid if you have that belief, you have it frequently, you believe that it's true, and it causes you distress. In this survey, I also asked people to complete a measure called the British Inventory of Mental Pathology, which assesses a variety of different symptoms associated with psychological distress. And here are the results. These are correlations. Those of you who've studied psychology or statistics will know that correlations can vary between 1 and -1. A score closer to 1 or -1 means that there's a closer relationship. And basically what I find is very weak evidence that people who are paranoid are more likely to endorse conspiracy theories, that people who show evidence of psychological distress, grandiose beliefs, paranoid beliefs, intrusive thoughts, somatic distress, that's where you manifest your psychological distress through your body and bodily symptoms, but these are really weak. They're nowhere near the smoking gun, the silver bullet, or the defining characteristic of conspiracy theories. My take-home message is there is a statistically significant, but really very weak relationship between belief in conspiracies and measures of mental distress and paranoia. The stereotype says that people believe these things because they're paranoid. The research suggests that perhaps it's not as clear-cut as that. I think part of the answer to what is driving this is that idea of magical thinking that I've already talked about, this ability to make connections between things that other people might not otherwise see. A third and fourth variation of these theoretical positions on deviant beliefs are what's called the attitudinal worldview hypothesis, the idea that some people have a subjective or emotionally driven view of the world that leads them to believe in slightly odd things, while some people have a rational, intellectual, or evidence-based view of the world that leads them to reject these kinds of dodgy ideas. Or my favorite version of all of these theoretical positions, which is a personality correlates or psychodynamic hypothesis. This is basically the idea that psychologically we do and believe the things that we do because they serve a function. And actually, I don't think it's too far away from the social marginality hypothesis, right? The idea that if you're part of a socially marginalized group, it helps to explain why you're a member of that group, why you're not at the top of the pile by believing in these sorts of things. So this kind of functional hypothesis says that sometimes we might believe in conspiracies because it is more psychologically comfortable to do so than believe that the bad stuff that happens in the world happens randomly. It helps give order to the things that we see. So what's the evidence for this? Ronald Inglehart, very famous political scientist, has argued, amongst other things, that social extremity sets the context for conspiracy beliefs. Those with political views to the extreme left or right, the extreme liberal or conservative, are going to be the people who are most likely to exhibit conspiratorial thinking. So in this particular figure that I show you here, he has levels of distrust up on the y-axis, and he has people positioned from political left to political right. And what this figure shows is that the people who are most extreme right or most extreme left have in common the fact that they are least trusting of the authorities around them. It doesn't matter whether you are an extreme Green supporter or an extreme ACT supporter, the odds are that you're part of a minority. Fewer people vote for your political party than vote for the mainstream parties. And as a result, we have to deal with this. Why is it that more people don't believe the things that we do? Or maybe it's because there's a conspiracy that's going on. Another one of my favorite studies. In 2013, Stefan Lewandowski and his colleagues published a paper in which they looked at the relationship between conspiracy theories, political beliefs, and attitudes towards climate change. This was a highly contentious paper at the time that it was published. So let me run you through this. This is a structural equation model. You can kind of think of it like a printed circuit board. If there's an arrow from one thing to another, then you can think of that like electricity flowing from, in this case, conspiracist ideation to climate science beliefs, or from conspiracist beliefs through to belief, cynicism about other sciences. And what this shows is that the more people feel supportive of free market economics, the more likely they are to disagree with anthropogenic climate change, the idea that the climate is changing and human beings have something to do with it. It's also the case that the more you believe in free market economics, the more skeptical of other sciences you are. The more you believe in conspiracies, the more skeptical of other sciences you are. This paper was primarily focused on the idea that the more you believe in conspiracies, the less supportive of anthropogenic climate change you are. Again, this is kind of like a correlation. And what it shows is that there's a statistically significant but weak relationship between conspiracy beliefs and climate science beliefs. It's much less strong than the relationship between your political economic beliefs, that the free market is the right way for things to go, and climate science, however. In a follow-up paper, Lewandowski and colleagues extended this idea to look not just at climate science, but several scientific issues. So, for example, genetically modified food safe? Are vaccinations safe? Is anthropogenic climate change really happening? And one of the consistent elements that they report is that the more people endorse conspiracy theories, the less positive they are, the less likely they are to believe that GM foods are safe, that vaccinations are safe, and that climate change is happening. Again, conservatism, political conservatism, and endorsement of free market economics were also strongly predictive of several of these things, vaccinations and climate change, but not genetically modified food safety. So what we have here is evidence for two things. Firstly, the extent to which you endorse conspiracies is associated with your belief in contemporary scientific issues like GM foods, vaccination safety, and climate change, but also that your political beliefs are quite important in this context as well. Remember that I've already shown you a study from the United States that shows that African Americans, who are actually usually politically liberal, but also Republicans, are more likely to be vaccine hesitant in the United States. So let me introduce you one of my intellectual heroes in psychology. This is Professor John Duckett, formerly, now he's an emeritus professor at the University of Auckland. And he is important for proposing what I think is as close to a grand theory of everything for social scientists like myself. It's called the dual process model of intergroup attitudes. And it's not to do with how people think about science or COVID or conspiracy theories. It's a model of how people think about different groups. I'll run you through this. According to John Duckett, there are one, two, or a combination of those two ways that people come to feel negative towards people who don't look like them, to show outgroup prejudice. In the first path, it originates in our childhood experience. If you experience a childhood where you're heavily punished for misbehavior, then you develop a personality that is very socially conforming. You don't like stepping outside the lines. As a result, you see the world as a dangerous place. You're very sensitive to threats or things that make it appear more dangerous. And that means that you are predisposed to believe that the authorities, the legitimate authorities, are the people who can look after you and keep you safe from the dangers in your world. As a result, you're more likely to like people who look like you because they're safe, and you're more likely to feel negative about people who don't look or don't believe the same things as you because they are threats to your view of the world. On the other hand, you may experience an unaffectionate socialization, not enough hugs. In this case, imagine growing up without parents who show you any affection. You probably develop a fairly ruthless, tough-minded kind of personality that sees the world as a competitive jungle, a place in which if you don't do the biting, you're going to get bitten. That there are bad people out to get you, and if you don't get them first, they're going to take your stuff. As a result, you see the world as a hierarchy with important people and things at the top, preferably where you're going to be, and less important people and things down the bottom. These are the things that need to be kept in their place. As a result, You like people who look like you because they're going to help reinforce your position in the world, and you dislike people who don't look or think like you because they are threats to your social position. This theory is tremendously powerful in explaining outgroup attitudes, beliefs about people who are different to you. In fact, in statistical terms, it explains about half of the variation in how people feel about those groups. But it also applies to other things. This is John Kerr, a PhD student of mine. He now lives in the UK. He works at the University of Cambridge. And as part of his PhD, we collected data from more than 9,000 New Zealanders, asking them about their beliefs about science, as well as these views of whether or not we should listen to authorities and whether or not we think the world should be a hierarchical place. What his research showed was that the older you are, generally speaking, the less likely you are to believe the contemporary scientific position. If you're a woman, you're also more likely to be sensitive to concerns about contemporary science. At the moment, in the context of COVID, we know that women with children are more likely to be vaccine hesitant, for example, than men who don't have any children. We also know, according to John's research, that people who think that the authorities are there to protect us are less likely to believe in climate change. They're less likely to think that GM foods are safe. They're less likely to think that vaccinations are safe. They're less likely to think that fluoridation in our water to keep our teeth sound is safe. And they're less likely to believe in evolution. And the more we believe that the world is structured hierarchically, or should be structured hierarchically, with important people at the top and less important people at the bottom, the less likely we are to believe in climate change and the safety of vaccines and fluoride. So let me put this all together in a second. We can take advantage of the structural equation modeling that I've mentioned earlier on. Remember, this is like that circuit board where we see some things providing power to others. So on the far left of the circuit board, we have authoritarianism, RWA, the extent to which people endorse authorities as being the important people we should pay attention to and who will look after us. And hierarchy, the extent to which we believe the world should be structured in such a way that some people are at the top and some people are at the bottom, and that's the way that it should be. These in turn provide power to a variety of other things: political conservatism, free market attitudes, whether or not we're religious, the extent to which we know a lot about science, the extent to which we trust scientists, and also the extent to which we believe in conspiracies. And that the outcome, the output of this printed circuit board is power to our beliefs about climate change, evolution, GM foods, vaccines, or fluoridation safety. Firstly, beliefs about authorities and hierarchies tend to predict most of these things sitting in the middle. Our beliefs about authority predict all of them. So the more we believe that authorities are important, the more politically conservative, the more free market supportive we are, the more religious we are, the more we believe in conspiracies, the less literate we are about science, and the less trusting we are of scientists. The more we believe that hierarchies are the way that things should go, the more politically conservative we are, the more we believe in free market economics, the less religious we are. This is one of the interesting things in this model. And also the less we trust scientists. However, the extent to which we trust scientists is the only thing of these things that sit in the middle of this figure that predict our attitudes to all of these scientific issues. So the less we trust scientists, the less we believe in climate change, the less we think that GM foods and vaccines and fluoride are safe, the less likely we are to believe that evolution is the way that human beings came to be the way that we currently are. Importantly, conspiracy beliefs predict how we feel about GM foods, about vaccines, and about fluoridation of our water. I think this is probably one of the reasons why we see what's happening in the world around us at the moment when it comes to COVID vaccination, for example. There are so many examples of medical conspiracies that perhaps it's not unreasonable to worry that the vaccinations that we're being told to take are in fact perhaps not good for us. The more distrusting we are of the message that perhaps COVID is not as dangerous as it appears. I'll show you, let you watch the animation because I'm very proud of this. It took ages to do. We also replicated this in the American sample as well. So it's not just Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we find this thing. In America, we find that conspiracy beliefs also predict decreased belief that GM foods are safe, vaccines are safe, and that fluoridation is safe. And again, importantly, the extent to which we trust scientists is importantly predictive of all of these things. Think at the moment when you turn on that 1 o'clock news bulletin, for example, how frequently have you seen Baker? How many times have you seen Jackson? These scientists, epidemiologists who work in this area, coming out and pummeling through this message about the importance of vaccinations. This, I think, is a really, really good thing, and I'm thrilled that they're out there. But if you don't trust scientists, then are you going to trust those people to tell you what's in your best interest? So let's have a look at this model in the context of skepticism about COVID. This is based on some Psych 122 student data, so about 800 students in one of our first year psychology courses who completed measures of right-wing authoritarianism, the extent to which you think the authorities are there to protect you, social dominance orientation, the extent to which you think that hierarchies are the way that the world should be organized, but also the extent to which you trust science. And we're using these to predict the extent to which people endorse the existence of COVID as a serious disease and the importance of vaccinations. And again, it pretty much works. That is to say that trust in science is consistently associated with all of these things. The more authoritarian you are, the less likely you are to trust science. The more social dominant or endorsing of hierarchy you are, the less likely you are to trust science. But the more you trust science, the less skeptical you are about COVID. The more authoritarian, the more social dominant you are, the more skeptical you are. And these things work through trust in science. If you're authoritarian or you believe that hierarchy is the way that the world should be structured, you'd see that you're less trusting of scientists. And that in turn means that you're less likely to believe that COVID is dangerous, that it's real, and that you should go out and get a vaccination for it. So far, I've talked about international research or research that I've conducted, and I'm going to finish by showing you some research conducted also in Aotearoa, but by people who aren't me. So in a recent study, which was conducted by Taylor Winter, a PhD student here at Te Rangawaka, Taylor's supervisor, Paul Jose, and a couple of other colleagues, originally from University of Otago, Damien Scarf and Ben Reardon, they conducted a fairly large-scale survey in which they asked New Zealanders about several things. To what extent did they believe in conspiracies? Did they see themselves on a scale from sort of 1 to 7? Would they characterize themselves as politically conservative or politically liberal? And how much did they trust science? And the important take home here is illustrated in the figure here. Trust in science is associated with conspiracy beliefs about COVID. So if you don't trust scientists, you're more likely to believe that COVID is a hoax and that vaccination is bad for you. The more politically right-wing or conservative you are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the more skeptical you are about COVID, but also the more you tend to be skeptical about science. But these things interact, and that's why these lines are not parallel. If we take the green line at the top, this is the line that represents those people who are most distrusting of science. If you are politically liberal and you're distrusting of science, then you sit somewhere around about, you're ambivalent about COVID conspiracies, you're on the fence. But if you are politically conservative, you strongly believe that COVID is a hoax. The red line in the middle is those people who are sort of moderate in terms of their trust of science, and they're kind of our middle ground. But if we look at our low distrust of science group, the people who are represented by the blue line, you can see that if you trust science, it doesn't matter whether you're politically or liberal, you're politically conservative or politically liberal in Aotearoa. The reality is that you feel pretty much the same about COVID, and that's generally that it's dangerous, it's a problem, and that we ought to get vaccinated. In combination then, I think the point that I'd like to make is that conspiracy theories are not just the province of tinfoil hat wearing people who have something wrong with them. The research does not support that. There's international evidence that suggests that how comfortable you feel in your control of the world around you is unrelated to your conspiracy beliefs, and I go along with that, accepting that some people, maybe these people who have a greater tendency to go looking for connections between things, are more likely, when they feel a lack of control of the world around them, to believe in conspiracies. And finally, these things have real-world implications. Conspiracy belief is associated with distrust. It's one of the most consistent relationships that we find. And in the world that we currently live in, with a global pandemic in which hundreds of thousands, millions of people have died, it is the case that those people who are least likely to believe, firstly, the popular press that COVID is a bad thing and that people have died, but also that vaccination is the right thing to do, are more likely to believe in conspiracies. So, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to having an opportunity to chat with you about what I've talked about and to answer your questions. And I really wish that we would have been able to do this in person. Thank you very much.
Ngā mihi nui, Mark. The applause is quiet, but very heartfelt. But I don't know if I should trust you.
Of course not, because I'm a scientist.
Yeah, I'm really doubtful.
Mm-hmm.
So this puts a lot of pressure on scientists, doesn't it? I mean, I'm pretty impressed by that. So we have a couple of questions that I would like to read out to you. Also, if people want to rather speak up and please raise your hand, then I can allow you questions also via voice. So one of the questions was related to the relationship. So you mentioned some aspects relationship to psychological phenomena, like or personality traits or these kind of things. But one question was if it was also related to creativity. Do you think that conspiracy theorists are just really creative?
So I think that there is a connection between these two things, creativity and conspiracy belief, that might be mediated by one of the 5 pillars of personality. So we know from tens of thousands of studies now that everybody's personality is based on maybe 5 different components, traits: extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, but importantly, one is called openness to experience. And what we find is that people who are open to experiences are more likely to both be creative, but they're also more likely to go, well, hey, you know what? That conspiracy theory could be the way that things that go. So maybe there is a component to that.
Okay, great, thank you. There's another question. Keela says, thanks for the interesting talk. You mentioned that many people hold 1 or 2 conspiracy beliefs while others hold multiple beliefs. Are there clusters in the types of beliefs that tend to go together?
Great question, Kayla. It's almost as if I planted it. So one of the things that I have done is, so I've asked people about their conspiracy beliefs in a variety of different ways. And there are 2 broad ways that we do this. In the first way, what people do is to ask, do you believe that, and I showed examples of this, do you believe that NASA faked the moon landings? Do you believe that the events of 9/11 were a false flag operation by the American government? But in the other way of measuring it, we ask people about their tendency to believe that the world is run by conspiracies. Do you believe that there are conspiracies happening in the background that nobody has evidence of? When we look at the specific conspiracies, we conduct a statistical technique called factor analysis, which looks for clusters of things which go together. There do seem to be families of conspiracy theories. So, for example, there's a family of conspiracy theories that seem to locate around our beliefs about whether or not aliens have visited the world, our Earth, and have been covered up by world governments. So, do you believe that Area 51 houses evidence of alien visits? Do you believe that thousands of people are kidnapped each year by aliens and it's covered up by government authorities? Relatively few people believe in those conspiracies. The most common conspiracies that people believe in are governmental conspiracies. So, for example, that the US government covered up evidence that had foreknowledge of 9/11 or were involved in planning it. And also a second group of conspiracies, which are about some kind of shadowy non-governmental organization, that maybe it's the Illuminati, maybe it's the Bilderberg group, maybe it's a small group of usually men who sit in the background and who are the puppet masters. So the short answer is yes, there are these families of conspiracy belief. But what we do know is that if you believe one conspiracy, you're also more likely to believe in others.
Can I add up to this one another question that was around if religious beliefs are sometimes grouped with conspiracy theories? So that seemed to be a question that somebody had.
Yeah, I tend not to think of things in that way. In the area of research on paranormal beliefs, probably one of the most influential people in the empirical study of paranormal beliefs is a guy called Jerome Tobachik. And he argues that paranormal beliefs are things, something is paranormal if it's outside the realm of our current scientific understanding to be able to explain, and that it's something that a minority of people believe. And actually, on the one hand, I think that things like religion, if there is a God, if God operates in the ways that many religious canons suggest, then it conforms to the first, which is that we can't scientifically explain it. But actually, depending on where you are, a majority of people may believe in religious phenomena. So I tend not to think that that's the case. At the same time, it is possible that people might believe that some religious authorities may be those shadowy organizations that sit behind things that influence world events.
Okay, so it's not really separable oftentimes.
Yeah.
I hear you. Another question is, do you think there would be a link between social media use, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and those two things making people believe they are more informed than scientists?
Oh, thanks, Anthony. I think so. I mentioned that the internet has provided a forum for a relatively small group of people who to come together and have their beliefs about things reinforced. Social media uses algorithms that mean that if you go in and look for evidence for conspiracy theories, you're going to find your YouTube or Facebook feed is going to increasingly become dominated by things of those kinds. So I think it's reasonable to think that, I think it was said best by, so there's a British journalist who wrote the book, Voyages with Extremists, and also The Men Who Stare at Goats. It was a Guardian journalist who said that after studying conspiracy theories for a while, he started to lose his point of reference. After being immersed with people who believe these things, it all started to seem a little bit too, like reasonable. The Dunning-Kruger effect refers to the idea that perhaps one of the reasons why we don't realize that the things we believe are silly is because we're not well equipped to know that we aren't well equipped. So it's kind of, why are you dumb? Well, it's because you're too dumb to realize that you're dumb. I'm not sure that there's a strong and consistent relationship between things like intelligence and paranormal belief or conspiracy theorizing. In fact, the research on paranormal belief suggests that it's completely independent. And that's partly because I think this attribute of openness to experience is the more important thing that's driving it.
Thank you. Another question was around basically, well, I'll just read it out. How do theories about conspiracies change depending on the conspiracy being something very far from the individual? For example, Elvis' death, I know nothing about it, or something related to individuals' knowledge and experience, for example, political decisions in very close, so proximity, basically, I think I'm gonna call this. So how much does it matter how close something is to one's own world? That's how I would read this question.
Yeah, so one of the concerns that I have about the research that I've done is that there's this consistent family of conspiracy belief that involves skepticism and cynicism about the American government. And so it's one of those factors in my factor analysis that coheres really closely together. It's not just governmental conspiracies, but actually American governmental conspiracies. And I think that what I worry about is that if I were to say the American government is responsible for dumping loads of poisoned milk powder in developing countries, people would go, yeah, that kind of sounds like the sort of thing they would do, even though I just made that up. So I think that there's something potentially underlying that kind of specific conspiracy, those specific families of conspiracy theorizing that might be independent of the extent to which you're familiar with, or the facts might actually support something like that. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is the benefit of assessing conspiracy thinking in a more general way. Do you believe that there are conspiracies that influence world events? Do you believe that there are small groups of people who seek to influence what's happening in the world around us that might get around that? But again, at the same time, if you're a distrusting and cynical person, then you're probably more likely to believe that as well. But it's a really important question here.
Yeah, related to that, another question that asks, how much does the social context play a role? And potentially, again, related to another question, social media. So what about your peers, and what about the social media in this context?
Yeah, so I think this is really important to acknowledge as well. I mean, I made the point that you and I had big work at a university where we have access to a lot of information, and we know people who actually have expertise in these areas. And therefore, it makes sense that we might have particular positions. If we're not in those contexts, however, then in fact, it makes perfect sense that we draw off the evidence that we have available to us. And that might be social media, it might be mainstream media, but it's also the people around us. And by and large, we surround ourselves with people who we like, who we trust, and who we think are like us. And therefore, when those people say something, we trust them. So I think that actually, on the one hand, I think it's very easy to say people who believe in conspiracies aren't approaching the world in an evidence-based way, but I think that that is privileging certain kinds of evidence. So science is itself a process by which we collect evidence on something. The body of scientific knowledge is a body of knowledge that is developed as a result. But actually, if I don't have access to that, then I should do exactly what people have done through our evolutionary past, which is rely on the people who are closest to us.
Related to this, now what should we do with this, especially when it comes to the belief in the science, right? So one of the questions was, how much do you think does colonialism play a role here, where people think, or some of the science is done and presented by scientists who are coming from abroad, and also linked to that. So how should teachers communicate these things in schools? What can teachers learn from this in terms of how to communicate science, and also to think about these perspectives that people might have in the group where it's coming from?
Wow. If I had the answer to that, I'd be able to make a lot of money. I'd be able to change the world. And I'll tell you why. So in the United States, for example, for the last 50 odd years, if you ask people whether or not they believe that human beings have evolved from simpler organisms over millions of years, it's been pretty consistently between 40 and 50% of people who say that they believe in the theory of evolution. In spite of the fact that there have been ongoing arguments about the teaching of evolution in schools. In fact, what we know is that if you teach people about evolution, it doesn't change what they thought, because in fact, that's one class, but they're going back to the environment that is the foundation for those things. So if you're strongly religious, for example, then you go into those classes and you go, look, that's a great story. I really enjoyed hearing it. And that's not the way that it is. So what I would point out is that it's really difficult to change people's positions on these things, in part because I think they're connected to people's worldviews. So when we're trying to educate people about climate change, we might be giving a message about climate change, but that people's belief about climate change is part of a broader network of things. And so we're tugging at one particular node, and it's got all the inertia and weight that goes along with the other things that are also attached to it. I also think that, and I mean, I don't know if the audience have experience of this, but the reality is that shouting at people and telling them that they're wrong and stupid tends not to change the way that they think about things. So one of the examples that I've used to illustrate a different way that we might do this draws off the work of people like Matthew Hornsey and Paul Bain, conducted in Australia, where they asked Australians, what kind of a world would you like to live in? What kind of an Australia would you like to find yourself in? And then once people had done that, they said, so if you go and recycle, if you go and pay attention to ethical consumership, if you try and avoid buying things that can't be, that have environmental impact, will that make it less likely you're going to get the Australia that you want? So rather than telling people that they're wrong, try and find some kind of common ground that might actually lead you to that. So that's one of the things that I would say. I think there's definitely a place for greater science literacy, however, but I don't think that's just about saying this is what science tells us. It's about educating what the process of science is. Because I do worry that, and that climate change is a good example of this, that many lay people think that if someone gets a grant to study climate change, that means they get more money. That if someone gets a grant to study climate change, that it actually, there's an incentive for us to do that, when in fact, by and large, people who get grants just have to do more work. So I think that we could do a better job of communicating how that process works. That was really long-winded. Sorry, Hedwig.
No, but this was also a very complex question. So thank you very much. And I think also this is one way we try to communicate science, right, with this series. So we want to really become better and probably to talk more about how to do this well. So let's learn alongside how to do this better. But I think you did a very good job in explaining it very well. So thank you so much again. Ngā mihi nui. And I need to, unfortunately, bring this to a close because it's already an hour. It was such a pleasure. Also amazing questions. Thank you all very much for your beautiful questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of them, or we didn't get to all of them. And I'm looking forward to see you in the next talk, which is going to come up next week. Thank you very much, Mark. Mā te wā.